Hey, U.S. Sister Students, this is Mr. Baker. Who doing well? This is our third installment of Baker's Corner as it relates to our Second World War topic. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want you to take a look at your screen right now, and you can see like a big set of letters here, but you can also see a pretty important picture. And my question, guys, to all of you is, who are the big three? And you see three people that stand out here. You've got Churchill, you've got FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and you've got, you guessed it, Joseph Stalin. Now, I'd be interested to know if y'all know this. Which one is the only one who actually stays in his leadership position through the entire war? And if you guessed Joseph Stalin, you would be correct. Okay. Stalin is going to be the leader of the Soviet Union about into the early 1950s. FDR died in April of 1945, so he's elected to a fourth term, and he's, of course, going to only be in office for a few months after that. And the guy's Churchill is going to actually not be the prime minister during the entire war. Okay. Now, I want you to think why that's important. Okay. So what's going to happen, guys, in this war is that you're going to have a series of meetings. Okay. And we call these World War conferences. Now, feel free to stop your screen if you want to, okay? And I'm going to give you a few basic details here that kind of set you up for what to kind of think about with a lot of different things, okay? And so first of all, guys, Casablanca, all right? I'll show you a little bit about the geography here in a second. But Casablanca, if you didn't know that, is in Morocco. This is held January of 1943. Now, the participants are important, okay? Because who do we not see out of the big three at Casablanca? You guessed it, Stalin. Stalin is not there. Now, there's different theories about why. The one that I've came across most often is that, you know, Russia or the Soviet Union is literally fending off the German, attempt to actually conquer it. That, by the way, was not successful. So they did accomplish their task there. There was a very big amount of impact there that we'll look at here in a moment. Okay. But the other thing, guys, is that Stalin does not have complete confidence, at least from what I've read, that the other Allied countries are going to actually open up what he calls a second front. What is meant by a second front? That would mean that we're actually going to be opening up a front to help out the Soviet Union to push Germany back. Okay. So what happens at this Casablanca conference? Well, this is the conference where FDR and Churchill are talking about campaign strategies, etc. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. They say, all right, we've got three major Axis powers, right? We've got the German government, we've got the Japanese government, we've got Italian government. What is going to be the most important thing? Well, think about it, guys. Location matters. So which one of those countries is located in East Asia? That's going to be Japan. The other two are European. Okay. So the thought is, okay, let's take out Italy and let's take out Germany. This is not an easy task, as we'll see here in just a moment. But the argument is we're going to concentrate there first. That does not mean that you're not going to see fighting occurring, as we'll look at, guys, on a map here in a second, during the Pacific and also the East Asian campaign. It does mean, however, that their strategy is more focused on that part of the war. How are they going to do that? Well, that's our next step. Okay. They also agree, for the time being, that Japan and all the other Axis powers must come to what's called an unconditional surrender. What does that mean? Pretty much you surrender under our terms. You hand over your government to us or whatever it might be. In other words, you know, you're going to basically meet our terms of surrender. Okay. As you can imagine, that sounds a little bit like some of the harshness of the Versailles Conference. Not exactly to that extent by all the powers, but certainly the Soviet Union, guys, will be the wild card here. What happens at the next conference, which, as you can see, is about 10 months later? Now, this one is important. Because what do we notice happening here? We notice the big three. And so they're talking about, okay, what do we do? How do we basically work this out? France is key. They want to liberate France. In order to do that, they're going to come up with this Operation Overlord strategy, which essentially leads to what we call D-Day, the invasion. This is where Dwight D. Eisenhower gets a lot of credit. Of course, we know he'll be a future president as well. But in this point, guys, he's a pretty important general in this conflict. We'll look at here in a second. But guys, for the most part, why is that important? Because the Soviets are eventually going to start to push Germany further west. The Allies are going to eventually take control of France. They're going to start moving toward Germany from the west to the east. What is the main city in Germany that they're all really trying to get to? Berlin. And guys, if you know anything about the history of the Cold War, which a lot of you might if you took world history before, that is going to be really big. Berlin becomes a big hot spot. All right, something for another day to consider, but something to keep in mind. The Yalta Conference happens, as you can see here, February 1945. Now, something for us to take a note on, guys. This is the last meeting that includes all these big three together. Why? Because FDR died a couple months later, and then Churchill is going to be out as the prime minister. At this point in time, Germany has not surrendered, although they will within a few months. But we're starting to see progress, as we'll see with our military study here in just a second. Okay? So the argument is, okay, we know that Germany is going to eventually surrender. Italy is going to, of course, surrender. Okay, what do we do? Well, the wild card here is twofold. One, what do we do with Germany? Now, I think it's safe to say, guys, France kind of understands, all right, maybe the way we treated Germany was not the best after World War I. Let's be a little bit more accommodating. Britain learned the same thing. The United States. What's the problem? Well, the problem is the Soviet Union, guys, was basically, you guessed it, attacked by Germany, a lot like France was in World War I. Okay, so Stalin is going to put up kind of like I guess what you would call a big barrier. Okay, what's the big thing? Poland. If you look at the geography of Poland, Stalin is going to want Poland to be pretty much under his direct control so that he can control their government. His argument is we don't want to have another invasion. Okay, but a lot of this is going to bleed into the idea of communism moving further into Eastern Europe. Okay, so that's a big deal. At this point in time, they do agree to divide Germany into a series of what they call kind of like zones of occupation. And all four of those major countries, the U.S., the British, the French, and the Soviets, are all going to have their own zone. Eventually, as we know, Germany is going to be divided into East and the West. However, that doesn't happen until about 4 years or so after World War II is over. Okay? And then what do we notice at Potsdam? A couple of important developments. This is July of 1945. Truman is the president. Guys, he is the third vice president of Roosevelt. Okay. He has only been VP, by the way, before he was inaugurated in April of 1945, since January. So, guys, he literally hits the ground running. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt that said something to Truman, you're in trouble now, or something like that. You know, that wouldn't exactly give me a lot of confidence or even a lot of encouragement. Okay. But Truman, guys, as some of you might know, is the president who eventually makes the decision, very tough decision, to use the atomic bomb during this campaign. Okay? Churchill and Clement Attlee. Attlee is going to be the eventual replacement of Churchill. And then, as you can see, Stalin. Now, at this point in time, what has America successfully done as of, let's say a couple of weeks before? They have successfully tested, you guessed it, the atomic bomb. So we know it works. Truman is kind of dancing around it a little bit. Now, guys, here's the thing that's kind of interesting. Stalin knows about this atomic bomb. He's got intelligence, but he kind of plays, I guess, a little bit dumb or a little bit ill-advised. Okay. And what happens is that it's like, okay, we're going to now focus on the Pacific campaign. Japan has to surrender, and then we'll go from there with how to deal with them. And the new weapon is, of course, the atomic bomb. Okay? So what happens with Europe? Well, we want to be able to force a surrender of Germany. We want to be able to force a surrender of course, Italy, those two countries. This is where these particular campaigns become really important. Feel free to pause because now we start our conversation. So guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice leadership matters. So you're going to have Eisenhower, as we just said, who's going to be pretty heavily involved with D-Day. Okay. And then you're going to have one of the other generals that stands out quite a bit by the name of George S. Patton. That's his picture right there. Patton is pretty much going to be put in charge of the Italian campaign. Okay. So guys, if you take a look here, Stalingrad is over here. So this is definitely Soviet Union. You want to think Stalin was Stalingrad. All right. So eventually, like we said in one of our previous lessons, guys, Germany does not succeed with forcing a surrender of Moscow. But there's a high price tag. Literally, guys, from the standpoint of money and also, troops. Okay, we'll see that on our last slide. Okay. But the issue is, guys, okay, if you're going to successfully force an Italian surrender and eventually German surrender, what are you going to have to do? Well, you're going to have to actually invade the countries or at least be in a position to do so. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense, according to this strategy, guys, to invade Italy from France because we've not occupied Paris yet. This is where the importance of This is where the importance of Northern Africa becomes pretty big. Okay. So what's going to happen? So as you can see here, a lot of this territory has been conquered or at least controlled by the Axis powers. This is where somebody like George S. Patton becomes important. So he's put in charge, or at least a lot of his leadership is there. The problem is we've also got to work closely with the British, which isn't a bad thing. But there's kind of a little bit of I guess what I would call, guys, a conflict of interest because they agreed, okay, we're going to take this part of Northern Africa, as you can see, and then we're going to invade Sicily. And from here, we'll also go into Salerno, which you can see is a little bit south of Rome. Well, there's a story, if you ever watched the movie Patton, that's really good. It's long. And I think this is pretty accurate. There was an agreement, guys, evidently by the British leader, Bernard Montgomery, who was another general, and then also General Patton. And the agreement is that the United States was not going to actually take Salerno before they actually communicated that, to the British. So fast forward the clock, and Patton was one of those guys that wasn't exactly the best follower with orders and things. And so what does he do? He ignores the order. And so he eventually ends up taking Salerno. So there's this scene, guys, in the movie where Patton is in the Jeep. His radio guy or whoever it was gets a call, and he's like, General, we got a problem here. And from what I understand, guys, Patton had this really raspy voice. Okay, private or whatever, what's the deal? What's the problem here, man? What's going on? Okay. And he said, we weren't supposed to take Salerno or Italy, right, before we communicated that to the British. And so Patton says back to him, well, let me ask him this. Does he want me to give it back to the Italians? And as you can imagine, the answer is no, right? I never really knew a whole lot about Patton, no real personalized stories. But when I was, shortly after college, I was friends with someone whose grandmother loved history. And it just so happened that we talked about it a lot. And so she read a lot about history. And I knew that her husband had fought in World War II, as a lot of our generation, or that generation did, excuse me. And so anyway, so we're talking. And she told me, she goes, yeah, my husband actually served under Patton in the North African and Italian campaign. I was like, really? That is interesting. And I said, well, I don't know if you talked about it much with him or not, but do you have any insights or stories I can tell my students or whatever? And this lady, guys, who was in her 80s at the time, so she was a little bit older, but very, very aware, very easy to tell stories. She goes, well, the only thing that he really ever said about Patton was that it was like a love-hate relationship. And I said, why is that? She goes, he hated every second that he served under him because of how just direct he was. And he would, just be really quick to point out if he thought you were acting soldier-like or whatever. And I said, well, that's interesting. What's the love part? And the love part was he made it back over so we could get married and start our family, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay. But what happens? He successfully ends up leading this campaign. Okay. And eventually, as you can see, they fight another battle of Anzio here. They do take Italy. And then by 1945, they are able to successfully take Italy. Now, what about the D-Day invasion? That's where you hear about the Normandy. If you look at my cursor, guys, you'll see. And this is going to be where, again, they're going to be moving in this direction eventually toward Berlin, as are the Soviets, as you can see here. Okay, so this battle is is important. By the way, kind of a neat little story. It almost didn't happen because of weather and other factors, but it was like, nah, we got to do this. We got to liberate Paris, which they eventually did. And as you can see here, guys, they're moving in the direction of entering Germany from Western Europe. The Battle of the Bulge, as you can see, is a pretty significant battle that allows them to eventually do that. Okay. So at this point, the question is, okay, who's going to get to Berlin first? And that's the real big thing that we'll look at later. Okay. Now, the question is, what about the Pacific Campaign? Okay. Well, if you take a look at my screen, you'll notice, guys, a couple of things that stand out. This one here is kind of neat. You've got Douglas MacArthur, who was probably, if not the most well-known military person of his day, certainly one of the top 2 or 3. Okay, 50-year military guy, a decorated officer, that kind of thing. And a lot of you guys are like, okay, well, I've heard of him maybe. I've never heard of Judith Marie Urett. And I've never heard of Mrs. Urett, which was Bernice Carnes Urett. Well, the reason is because they're people that you probably don't read about in the books. That's actually my grandmother holding my mom. So my mom was born in July 13th of 1944 while my grandfather was fighting abroad. So he was in the Navy, actually chose to join. Okay. And as you can see here, my mom, I'm going to assume she was probably about a 6-month-old baby then. Pretty cute little baby there. But anyway, and guys, if you read this closely, and I'll show you this on the map next, my grandfather, as a lot of people that fought in the Pacific, were involved in what is called island hopping. So different areas, eventually the Philippines. What is island hopping? Okay. Sometimes you also will hear this referred to as leapfrogging. All right. So imagine if you've ever heard of lily pads, each little island area, or at least a lot of them, are going to be like these places where America is trying to strategic take. Now, let's face the facts. There is no way in the world that you can take every single island in the Pacific. All right? That's not feasible. So what the island hopping strategy allowed us to do is to kind of strategically pick where were the Japanese most dug in, what is the most important from the standpoint of putting pressure. Because guys, think about it. What is the ultimate big picture goal of the island hopping and Pacific campaign? It's going to be eventually pushing a surrender of Japan. Okay. Which is not easy. Okay. And so you're going to see some key battles midway. The map on the next slide will make this more clear. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Those of you that are familiar with Mr. Miyagi from the Karate Kid series always hear him talking about it. He's from there. Okay. Leyte Gulf is another big battle. And then, of course, guys, MacArthur. Now, you can pause the screen if you want to, but take a look at what's going on. Okay. So you'll notice, again, a lot of moving around, leapfrogging, island hopping, etc. Okay. And so the Americans are moving in this direction from Pearl Harbor. Okay. So what do? We're like, okay, we're going to start some of these campaigns. So we start this campaign, Coral Sea. Midway is right here, as you can see, Guadalcanal. Excuse me. Okay. And then you'll notice, guys, the push over here into the New Guinea area, which is one of the areas that my grandfather served, and then also the Dutch East Indies. Okay. So what this is allowing us to do, guys, is twofold. One, it's allowing us to move closer to Japan in this direction, and it's also allowing us to move closer to mainland Asia, which they've already taken a pretty amount of control over, as you can see. Okay. And so they move into the Philippines, as you can see. That's the Leyte Gulf battle. All right, so progress is being made. Okay. At this point in time, none of the Axis powers have surrendered, but they're moving in that direction. All right, we know that now. They didn't know that then as much. But then what do we notice? We notice again the Iwo Jima campaign, the Okinawa campaign, and then the famous 2A bombs that we used. Okay. And I'm not going to say much about this because it is a controversial topic. Okay. But it is something, guys, to keep in mind. I once read a story by Harry S. Truman, just really quick as we wrap this up, guys. And somebody once asked him, and I'm not saying he should have done this or not. Y'all can land your plane on it. But somebody once asked him, because if you didn't know this, he actually lives beyond the war. He's the president until 1953. So during most of Korea as well. And somebody once asked him, they said, what was the most difficult decision? And his argument is that it was Korea. It was not using the A-bomb. All right. Part of that argument, guys, as you can see here, was, the possibility of losing more American lives. I've seen estimates as low as 250,000 to be able to invade the island of Japan, and as many as 2 million. Okay. You want to read a really, really, really good book. I think it's called Freedom from Fear. It basically analyzes the Great Depression time period and also World War II. So it's very thick. It was written by David Kennedy, who's a wonderful historian if you've not heard of him. And guys, in that book, Kennedy makes an interesting argument where he seems to come across research that suggests that maybe those estimates were kind of blown a little bit or whatever. But nonetheless, the argument is that you're probably going to have to invade Japan if you're going to force them to surrender. All right, unless you use the A-bomb. Okay? So eventually, guys, what has happened? So May 7th of 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. Germany surrendered. All right, there's different theories about Hitler. I personally think he did take his own life in his bunker, amongst other high-ranking Nazis. Nonetheless, what happens? The Manhattan Project has been in effect. This is the project, guys, that was headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer. I think a lot of people have always heard of people like Albert Einstein. This is Oppenheimer's picture. Very important. Okay. So what happens? You've got different countries working. U.S., U.K., Canada. Guys, look at this number of contributors. 130,000 people. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of physicists. All right, amongst other people too, but especially scientists. And it's hush-hush, right? They're not really talking about it. This is top secret. Okay, ergo Manhattan Project, as it was codenamed. They do successfully test it. $2 billion in 1945 currency. And then, of course, they use the A-bomb, as you can see. Japan is going to eventually surrender September 2nd of 1945. VJ Day is victory over Japan. Interesting story, though, as we wrap this up. How does this impact that unconditional surrender thing? The answer is, guys, we eventually let them keep their emperor. Because the people were so committed, guys, to their emperor and his leadership that it's strongly thought that you would have had, again, probably to invade. Maybe you would have had, children that were fighting to try to uphold their emperor, and ergo, you would have had a lot more issues on your hands there. Okay, so therefore, Japan surrenders. At the end of the day, I want to end with this slide. What do we notice? Now, this is not every country, guys, that had deaths. But what do we notice? You can take a minute to pause the screen if you want to. Okay. But what do we notice about the way that this war took its toll? Yeah. Over 50 million casualties, if you include them plus others that you can research. Okay. Soviet Union, guys, this is a lot. If you do the math here, About 2/3 of them were military people. The other third were civilians. Okay. This does not bode well for the peace process post-war. Okay. China, as you can see here, they don't really have any records. According to this website that I went to, 2% of their pre-war population was killed. As far as the difference there, Germany, as you can see, pretty significant. And then what do we notice about Poland? Yeah, what is that? Almost 50 times the amount of military deaths. Anybody know why? Holocaust, to a large extent. The United States, as you can see, all military casualties here. Okay. So something for us to keep in mind. Our next session, we're going to pick up by looking at a theme that we studied with World War I, but we're going to look at it, the comparison and some contrast. And that is going to be the way that World War II had a pretty significant effect on our home front. As always, hope you had a good session. I know I did. This is Mr. Baker, Baker's Corner. Feel free to email me with any questions. And as always, stay safe, and I will see you next time. See you guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.